Tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the 2015 Condliffe Memorial Lecture. My name's Sonia Maisie, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the College of Business and Law. On behalf of the College and the Department of Economics and Finance in particular, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's guest speaker, Dr. Terry Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the William A. Dunn Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center, as well as the John and Jean Denault Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Actually, this is his second visit to the University of Canterbury, as he was a Fulbright Fellow here back in 1988. So, welcome back, Terry. Dr. Anderson is an internationally renowned environmental economist whose research helped to launch the idea of free market environmentalism and has prompted widespread public debate over the proper role of government with regard to the management of natural resources. He is the author or editor of no fewer than 38 scholarly books. His most recent publications include Free Market Environmentalism for the Next Generation, published earlier this year, and Environmental Markets, A Property Rights Approach, which was published in 2014. He's also published widely in professional journals and the popular press, including frequent editorials in the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Anderson has received high recognition for his research, the policy impact of his research, and also for his teaching. In 2011, he was awarded the Liberalny Institute's annual award in Prague for his ideas promoting freedom and prosperity. Previous recipients of this award include Nobel laureates Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, and Vernon Smith. Earlier this year, Dr. Anderson also received the Gary Walton Award for Excellence in Economic Education from the US Foundation for Teaching Economics. The title of this evening's lecture is Environmental Markets, Lessons from and for Fisheries Management. Given the high political salience of environmental issues and environmental policy here in New Zealand, and the fact that the Ministry of Primary Industries is currently reviewing fisheries management policy in New Zealand, this evening's lecture could not be more timely or more topical. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Dr. Terry Anderson to the lectern.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure, and what a great reunion for me. Great to be back and to be honored with this audience. It was a while back. I was a little younger in '88, I think. In fact, I was doing the quick math and realizing that was almost 30 years ago. But as we were driving around today and we would come across some street or road, I would say, oh, I remember that street. Although, of course, your city looks much different. Well, it's an honor to be here, and I'll jump right into the lecture. I thank you for sparing me the economics jokes, especially a political scientist would enjoy picking on economists, but maybe you don't know all the jokes. There are jokes like if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they wouldn't point in a single direction. If you laid all the economists in the world end to end, it would be a good thing. And most people think that's the most appropriate. Hopefully you will not think that before the evening is done. Well, the title is really dealing with fisheries management, but I couldn't help but put in a plug for the book that I published a year ago with my good friend Gary Leibkap, entitled Environmental Markets, obviously the first part of the title for the lecture, A Property Rights Approach, and that's going to be a major theme that'll run through the lecture. But I thought I would, I gathered that most everybody here is not an economist. Is that fair to say. Most people don't admit it if they are anyway. But all right, well, assuming you're not, I thought I'd give you just a little bit of background that will be useful for this lecture, the kind of stuff that we economists think is crucial to understanding all kinds of policy, but certainly environmental policy. So let me just quickly jump into the importance of the way we think about the world as being a world in which there are trade-offs, and we have these things called isoquants, and these isoquants show the trade-off between, in this case, labor and capital and resources, and they show. Well, let me just move on from that one and show if you take all the stuff in this one, they really are important because if you're really good and you find all the intersections and tangency points and so on, you can then get a resource conversion path that looks like this, and that's important because it shows you how you can get the most. But what's really important is if you take all the stuff and how you can convert all those resources into good things for we people, then you can compare how the individual X would get utility from that with how an individual Y would, and there's this maximum amount you can produce here, BB, and then if you superimpose upon this the social welfare function, which you can ask any economist to tell you what it is, and it's really useful because it helps us find omega, the bliss point. Now, and imagine, I've just given you a lesson in how to take society to omega, the bliss point. What could be more valuable than that? But I think probably this explains one of the other economist jokes. And I was introduced and asked, you know what an economist is, don't you? And of course, I was obliged to say no. And the answer was an economist is someone who's pretty good with numbers, but doesn't have enough personality to be an accountant. And so, all due respect to those of you who are accountants. And, it's pretty easy to imagine how you can earn that reputation. I really like, if I can back up, I don't like doing that with PowerPoint, but this is one of my favorite slides. You put that in front of students and they're just dazzled. They think, man, you must be smart if you can figure out what that means. But it is the way we economists think about the world. We think about these wonderful omega points. And I want to get you to understand just how important it is to economists, but how unimportant it is to everybody in the real world. But the real world is a special case that we economists don't deal with. So who cares about omega? Well, economists are pretty much the only people. And I thought I could illustrate this by getting you to think about what I'm calling wolfonomics. Now, I come from Montana, which is on the border with Yellowstone National Park, and my wife and I live about 90 miles from the northern border of Yellowstone. And we've had a pretty big controversy as wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995. President Clinton okayed the importation of 19 wolves from Canada, legal immigrants in that case. From Canada, we brought them into the U.S. and put them into Yellowstone Park. Now, so what does all this have to do with economics? Well, the economist asks, well, how would you think about wolf reintroduction? And of course, again, one more graph. We think of it strictly in terms of benefits and costs. So we think, well, there are these benefits that come from introducing more wolves, but there's a limit to those benefits. The more you introduce, eventually they aren't worth as much as those first ones. And there's a cost to introducing them, and eventually the cost can get, very, very large. Ask Little Red Riding Hood. She probably thinks the cost of wolves are pretty high. And so when economists talked about this, or when you're teaching an intro course in economics, in fact, I used to do that with several hundred students, and I would get them so they would always recite, if the benefits are greater than the costs, do it. And if they couldn't answer a question, I would just pretend to be directing the choir. And this was always an answer that we economists relied on. But the question is really, whose costs and whose benefits? And here, since this is a lecture, I've put on my economist hat. Since this is a lecture on the environment, I thought I would put on my environmentalist hat for a few minutes. And get you to think about how people thought about wolf reintroduction if they wore the environmentalist hat. To the environmentalists, and this is a quote actually from the assistant superintendent of Yellowstone at the time that wolf reintroduction was taking place, and the mantra was, This is the last missing link in the ecosystem. And so you imagine you're bringing back this species that just, it's the last piece of the puzzle, and you just have to work it around and put it in, and everything will be fine. And the idea was that we had too many elk in Yellowstone. They were overgrazing the riparian areas. Willows were just disappearing. Aspen trees were thought to go extinct within a couple of decades if we kept this up. So by putting wolves back in, we got them to munch on these critters here and reduce the elk herd. And this was going to really save the ecosystem. However, thinking about costs and benefits, some other people weren't quite enamored with this notion of the last missing link in the ecosystem. And I have rancher friends who said the only good wolf is a dead wolf. And there were posters with a rifle scope and the crosshairs on wolves, and shoot a wolf, give them lead poisoning, all kinds of things of that sort. And if you go back to my sort of idea, whoops, I'm sorry, I meant to get the other picture up there. If you go back to the notion of what's the optimal number of wolves, ranchers would have said, we had the optimal number. We had none. And it took a while to get there. We had to kill them by trapping and shooting and poisoning. And we finally got to 0. Why would we want to bring wolves back? And needless to say, if you take those two pictures and you try to put them together, they don't go together very well. And the conflict that arose over the wolf reintroduction was just incredible. And I think it was incredible because people have different views of what the costs and benefits are. And it was really a question of, well, who's going to rule here? Whose rights matter? Is it the rancher who said, hey, I have grazing rights. I own land. I lease land from the federal government. I put my cattle out there to graze. And you want to put predators out there and kill my livelihood? And then on the other hand, you had people who said, wait, this is restoring nature. This is taking us back to what nature ought to be, the last missing link in the ecosystem. So, did the wolves have a right to be there, or the people who wanted them? Did the ranchers have a right to be predator-free? And the result was strictly a zero-sum game. That is, if the ranchers won, no wolves, then they got the benefits of having no wolves, and the people who wanted this last missing link lost out. But, and this conflict went on for many, many years. It took many years to get the wolf reintroduction to take place in 1995. It finally happened, and it happened in large part thanks to what I call an environmental entrepreneur. And this begins to get you a flavor of what I think environmental markets are. This is a good friend of mine. His name is Hank Fisher. He worked for Defenders of Wildlife and was one of the strongest proponents of wolf reintroduction. And Hank tells the story so wonderfully, and you can just imagine this. Hank was trying to convince people around Yellowstone Park that this was a good thing, the last missing link. And he organized a meeting on the western border of Yellowstone, where there are some people who would have a real affinity with New Zealand, where they raise a lot of sheep. And he organized this meeting at a little schoolhouse in the little town of Ashton, Idaho. And he said he walked into the schoolhouse and he looked out, and there was a sea of cowboy hats. And he walked up in front of the room to tell them how wonderful it was to bring back the last missing link. And the first person who spoke before he did said, Hank Fisher, ain't nobody killed you yet? And Hank said, I knew it was an uphill battle from there. This was going to be a tough sell. And you can imagine, he's up there just sweating, thinking, what am I going to say to these people? But Hank was not your typical environmentalist. And he called me one day as he was embroiled in this debate. And he said to me, I think I've finally gotten it figured out. It's the old economist song, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And I'm asking the cattle ranchers, the sheep ranchers, to provide the lunch for my wolves. And he said, I understand why ain't nobody killed you yet. I understand I am asking them to bear the cost while I get the benefits. And I said, yeah, great, Hank, you've learned your economics well, but that doesn't solve the problem. But Hank, being more entrepreneurial than just that zero-sum game, I'm going to shove it down the throats of the ranchers, said, I have a better idea. wandering around a bit too much. Hank said, what if I came up with a scheme to pay the ranchers if they lost livestock? And so he had an artist from Montana paint a picture, stylized view of wolves howling before the geysers of Yellowstone. And then he printed this poster. I don't know what the painting sold for, but the poster itself was printed up, and he sold them for $35 each. Within a few weeks, Hank had raised $100,000, and he put it into a trust account in a bank and said, if you lose any livestock to wolves, I'll pay you. We'll come to an agreement as to what the market price is. So you couldn't come in and say, oh, you know, that was old Bessie, and she was my kid's favorite cow, and she was priceless. That didn't work. Hank said, I'll pay you the market value. And if it happened to be a cow that was pregnant, he even agreed to pay more than just the value of that cow. He said, you're going to have some offspring. I'll pay you for that as well. And all of a sudden, Hank really changed the whole debate in the environmental community regarding wolves. And he changed the debate in some ways around a lot of environmental policy in the United States. Just if I can fast forward, I just did an interview with Hank for a radio program, and he was telling me about the lessons from this and what he learned. We have another issue in Yellowstone. I'll get off of the local U.S. examples in a moment. But we have another issue in Yellowstone, and it is that the bison migrate out of, I used that term once in Australia, and somebody said, I thought a bison was a place where you washed your hands. These are buffalo, not bison. So there's this issue of buffalo, that gets it clear, migrating out of Yellowstone, and they carry brucellosis, and the brucellosis can be transmitted to cattle. The cattle abort their young, and again, ranchers don't like buffalo. They don't like seeing them come out of the park. And so people have said, well, just get your cattle away. You know, just move away if you don't like it. Other people have said, well, let's shoot the buffalo. So I'm a hunter, so, you know, you might, well, that's great. We'll have a hunting season on buffalo. But Hank took a very different approach again. Learning from his experience with the wolves, he went out and, again, raised some money and started going around to ranchers and saying, what if I could buy you alternative grazing territory, especially during the time when you might come into contact with buffalo? And, you know, the rancher's saying, well, you're sounding like a nice guy, a cooperative guy. You're taking it away from I win, you lose, or the other way around. Hank said the other day, this was about 2 weeks ago, he has currently retired 900,000 acres around Yellowstone Park from grazing. You won't even find that in the newspapers. He did it without any fanfare. He did it without going to Congress. He did it with just using a market approach. And basically, what Hank did was said, I want to take some ownership in the wolves, in a sense. And I want to pay for the damage they're causing you. I don't want you to provide a free lunch. Now, some of his environmental colleagues said, well, why should we pay those evil ranchers who are grazing on this natural grass? And Hank said, you know, you can fight the zero-sum game if you want, but let's just get her done. Let's make it happen. That's a good backdrop for thinking about environmental markets. And the way I put it, Hank loves this quote. I used it as a chapter title in a book. No one washes a rental car, and that's the title of the chapter. But then somebody told me, what about Hertz? And I thought, yeah, bingo, that's the point. If you don't own the car, you're less likely to worry about whether it's going to be washed and whether it's going to last longer and stay shiny. But if you're Hertz, you care, and you care because you have an incentive to worry about whether you're going to take care of that asset. And so ultimately the question to me is, how can we make the environment an asset rather than a liability? And the answer from, put my economist hat back on, is to think of environmental problems as property rights problems. Who owns this thing? So the problem with the wolf was, before Hank, was that nobody owned the wolves. They were just going to be there. They were nature's creatures, and nobody was going to be liable. And the rancher said, oh, yeah, well, we'll take care of that. They're a liability to us. We'll shoot them. And Hank said, no, I'm going to take responsibility for them. I'm going to claim, in a sense, ownership of wolves and pay you. Now, it wasn't quite like a title to a piece of land your car or some other asset, a stock or a bond. But if you start thinking about property rights and asking, can we define the property rights? Can we enforce those property rights? And then the market part is, can we allow people to trade them? You can see, since this is about fisheries, where perhaps this whole argument is going. But the point is, if we start thinking about an environmental problem, you pick one, and I can put it into this box. It is a property rights problem. Who owns the air? Who owns the water? Who has the right to use that water either for irrigation or keep it in the stream for salmon migration? That's the way that we can think about how you might make the environment an asset rather than a liability. Now, when I first started writing about this, I did write a book entitled Free Market Environmentalism with a colleague, Don Leo. We published that book in 1991, and we were trying to make a case for environmental markets. And everybody was scoffing at us, and in fact, one of the reviewers said, in reviewing the book, said, free market environmentalism is an oxymoron, and then added, the authors are the moron part. That was, I've always wanted to use that on somebody else. But it really captures this notion of how can you possibly have an environmental market? I mean, they just can't exist. And yet, fast forward, if you will, to the more recent publication of that book, plus the Environmental Markets Property Rights Approach book. Both those books, written 20 years, 30 years after, 20 plus years after the first edition of the oxymoronic book, and all of a sudden there are just examples everywhere. Water markets. All around the country, your neighbors in Australia have pioneered using water markets to resolve many of the disputes over how much water is going to be left in the Murray-Darling, how much is going to be used by cities, how much is going to be there for other purposes. In California today, where I spend part of my time, the drought has made people in California very aware of the fact that we price water so cheaply, and I understand here in Christchurch you don't monitor, you don't even meter your water. If you don't meter water, guess what? People aren't going to worry. It's like a rental car. And so I always say water is cheaper than dirt. And as a result, people treat it that way. They don't take care of it. But where water markets are growing up, and I could go on with some environmental markets in the United States where environmentalists following Hank's lead are purchasing water and leaving it in stream for salmon and steelhead and endangered species. So water markets is just one example. If you look at Africa, and doubt are aware of the Cecil the lion issue, which hit the press a while back with the dentist shooting the lion. But if you go to places in Africa where a market approach is taking place, and it's taking place under a program called, if I can do it, Communal Areas Management Program and Indigenous Resources. No wonder they call it Campfire, right? But this is a program that World Wildlife Fund set up and said, we're going to try and organize the community around ownership of wildlife. We'll let them market the hunting of that wildlife. They'll keep the receipts from that, and let's see what happens. And I once met a game warden from one of these communities, and I said, if you catch a poacher, do you kill him? He said, oh, no, not the first time. We just beat them up. We beat them up badly enough they get back to where they came from, and they send a message. Don't go back there. Second time, yeah, that's a different story. But the point of this is, now those wildlife are an asset, and they don't mess with poachers. And as a result, wildlife populations in these campfire areas are burgeoning. There's no problem with endangered lions. There's no problem with endangered elephants. They're doing very well because they've been made an asset. We played around with this idea with emissions trading in the United States for sulfur dioxide. We had a huge problem with sulfur dioxide. And in 1992, we reformed the Clean Air Act in the United States, and we created property rights to the air, in a sense. We said we're going to issue permits for people to emit sulfur dioxide, and then if anybody else wants to emit, they've got to buy back some permits. They can retire them. School kids even went out and raised money from bake sales and other fundraising and tried to buy sulfur dioxide permits to reduce sulfur emissions into the air. This system was working quite well, and I'm not going to go into it unless we raise it in question and answer. But it was working quite well until the federal government said, well, we're just going to change the trading rules a little. So they were trading these sulfur dioxide credits 1 ton of emissions. If you wanted to emit a ton, you had to buy a ton and reduce them by that amount. And then they said, well, we're just going to change it to 2. You have to buy 2 to reduce it by 1. And people holding these credits for emission trading said, this doesn't seem to be very fair. You've just changed the price ratio, if you will. And all of a sudden, the sulfur dioxide trading market tanked. It went right into the bottom. And now it's just dissolving in a way that makes it almost impossible to use it to solve our sulfur emission problem. And I've done a little work on the emission trading, carbon trading in the EU, and the same thing. It started out working quite well, but then, well, you're surely going to give us some carbon emission credits if we put in an alternative energy kind of generating plant, solar or wind. And so you issue more of these credits. Now the ones that were there to begin with aren't worth as much, and people start saying, I don't know if I want to mess with this market. So if you tinker with these markets very much, you can end up with some real problems. Well, this is to be about fisheries, so let's talk about the race to fish. Clearly a problem. I love the one on the left there. I can't imagine. This is the Bristol Bay salmon fishery and outside of Alaska, and every time I look at this, I try to think, how could you possibly end up with anything but a mess? In fact, we had one of the fishermen from that fishery come to a conference we did, and he talked about how the opening day of the salmon derby, the Fish and Wildlife people would stand on the dock with a pistol, and everybody's in their boat, and they've got the engine revved up, ready to throw it into gear to the start of the season. The pistol goes off, and they all race out like this. Well, this is clearly an extreme example of this, but it's the way fisheries were run around the world. We'll have this derby, run out and catch as many as you can, and we're going to have a problem. And so, just to give you an idea, so we said, well, the solution to this is we'll just regulate this fishery. And so, well, if there's a problem with people racing out there every day, we'll just cut back the season. So we'll make the season less and less and less. And people said, oh, well, if it's a shorter season, then I'm going to make sure I fish 24 hours every day. And so people went out and fished 24 hours, and we said, well, we're going to have to somehow limit it some more, so let's limit the number of boats. And people got bigger boats. We said, well, let's limit the number and size of boats. And people said, let's invest in electronic technology. And around the world, it was clearly a case of regulatory policy wasn't exactly solving the problem. I just put in this chart of what happened to the British Columbia halibut fishery. This column shows the season length starting in 1980. And look what happened. 64 days. It gets down to 6 days. Now, all I remember about halibut is when I was a kid in school, all we had were these frozen fish sticks. And they were just virtually inedible. You'd probably prefer cardboard. But what are you going to get? Well, if you go to a 6-day season, you're going to have to just freeze all the stuff and serve it in fish sticks. And indeed, you don't have very much marketed fresh. And then British Columbia implemented a quota system, an individual transferable quota system. And when they introduced this property rights system, it says we're going to give some property rights to the fishery. Not surprisingly, the season length went up because people said, I'm not going to race out there to fish on a day that I might wreck my boat. And the amount of fresh fish skyrocketed, so we're not eating just low-valued fish sticks any longer. That ITQ system, thank you very much to some people in this room. Hats off, especially that hat. Hats off to the people in New Zealand for really leading the world in the use of ITQs, individual transferable quotas. New Zealand and Iceland are the sort of two that I put on a pedestal for this. And what happened in New Zealand is in sharp contrast to what happened in the United States. And the sharp contrast is that New Zealand really created some real, I call them real property rights. Go back to my earlier list. They were well defined, they are pretty strictly enforced, and they were tradable. This just warms the cockles of an economist's heart. This is the perfect way to create an environmental market. And it has worked very well. Your quota here are worth a lot of money. They're held by people who care very much about their rental car. They're the Hertz people. They wash their rental car and they take good care of it. two good friends of mine, Chris Costello and Corbett Granger, have written extensively on this, and I'm going to show you some data that's a little more complicated from them, but bear with me, it's not quite as bad as those graphs. But and they've said insecure property rights lead to inefficiently high extraction rates. So that was the previous chart. And they began to ask, how can we measure the security of property rights? And here, I'll give you this chart, but I'll take a minute to explain it. Chris and Corbett said, let's look at the price at which quota are leased. So this is what you could go out and lease a certain amount of fish that you could catch for a season. Let's compare that lease price to the sales price. That is, the value if you kept it over its long haul. And so imagine it this way. Suppose that you thought tomorrow you were holding some quota, and you thought tomorrow the government was going to take your quota away. Well, the lease price and the sales price would be exactly the same. They would just mirror one another because you don't get any future value. This is the rental car. You don't see any future value in caring for this quota. So Chris and Corbett measured the lease price to the sales price. And so the farther those get apart, we're dividing by the sales price. The higher the sales price is relative to the lease price, the lower that line is going to be. Over here, just look what it says. The sales price to the lease price is 12 times in New Zealand. So that's telling you this is an asset. People are thinking about the future of this asset. They're worried about it. Now, I can show you this dotted line here with the little triangles is the United States, where our fisheries policy relating to the use of an ITQ system says explicitly this is not a property right. You don't own this thing, and we can take it from you whenever we want without any compensation. Well, if you're worried about that and you think that tomorrow the government may just tell you that this quota that you've been taking care of, nurturing, and thinking is a valuable asset is going to be taken away from you, then you might expect that the sales price will start to collapse to the lease price. And in the United States, it's only about 3 times as high, telling you that, you know, this is a rental car that you're not looking to the future on. You're not going to continue taking good care of. So the bottom line here is New Zealand has created a property rights system that I think is unsurpassed in the world. There are maybe some of the Icelandic ones are as secure, but the fact that New Zealand said these are real property rights has made a huge difference. So where does that take us? Well, economists, starting clear back when in 1989, and this was from the Pierce report in 1991, began looking at fisheries policies. Economists started saying, you know, this can really work, but those who hold the rights to fish should have even more responsibility in managing them. Get the people who are out there in the boats, taking care of harvesting those fish, thinking about a value of a quota that's 12 times higher than the lease price, get them more involved. And many more economists have dived into this pool and done research on these issues. And everybody who looks at it says the same kind of thing. It's time to figure out a way to give the people who have a stake in this resource, the people who have ownership of this car, something to sink their teeth into to make it even more valuable. So let me just touch on a few cases where I think we can ponder at least ways in which people around the world, but certainly here in New Zealand, can take advantage of the advice from the Pierce report and other economists. If that's, given what I said at the beginning, you may say, why would we take advice from economists? But so how might we think about this? Well, think about just the production of information about a fishery. If you don't own that thing and somebody wants information about what you're doing, you're not likely to dump that information on the table and make it readily available. But if you own it, you have an incentive to capture that information, to invest in that information. And so if we ask the question, is this something government should do or industry should do? It's not a simple question to answer. It's not quite like finding omega, which is quite easy. It's a matter of trying to figure out where the incentives are and how to incentivize the people who have a lot of information. They might not be fisheries biologists trained here at Canterbury, but they have a lot of information about that resource and ought to be brought into that system of information production. If that would happen, then, and Bob Deacon, whom I quoted, or who was in the previous slide, has done a lot of work on cooperatives in Alaska. And what we find is that people who have secure quota rights, and they're a little more secure in some of those fisheries, especially because they've formed cooperatives, have started to say, hey, we can invest in this fishery and do better, and we will do the research to figure out how to do it. How do you set the TAC, the total allowable catch, or the total allowable commercial catch? Well, again, we can have government scientists do that, and there certainly is a role for that, but by bringing the people who have the asset, who see this asset value into this equation, we can perhaps do even better. What about and this is a huge problem in the United States and the growing problem here in New Zealand, what about the recreational fishery, the customary fishing rights? How do we do that? Well, I would ask you to go back. I kind of glossed over the issue with the Maori rights here, but, oh, thank you very much. I was thinking you'd bring me the bottle of white wine that was out there. That would have been a little better, but I'll stick with the water. So if we go back and again, there are some good data on what happened with the value of the New Zealand quota when New Zealand decided to buy back rights to solve cut the Maori into what they rightfully deserved, rather than just say we'll take them. I think we had a classic example of a way to deal with these kinds of issues, but it requires defining those rights and knowing whose they are. And that's a problem that needs to be dealt with in the recreational and customary rights context. And the question is, how can government make these rights clearer so that they can be incorporated into a property rights system that is showing itself to be a way to create a fisheries asset? And then there's a question of how do you protect the marine ecosystem part of this, the overall environmental interconnected issues, which we were talking about earlier this evening before I started lecturing. This is a case where government has a huge role to play, because it's hard to know how you make interconnect I don't remember all the terms of the kelp and the urchins and the powwow, but the point is clear. This is not an easy problem to resolve, and the question is there a way to create property rights that integrate this into the system so that the property rights are of value? Well, I'm happy to talk more about those in the Q&A. Let me wrap up by taking you back home to Montana in the 1860s and 70s, and introduce you to some nice folks who were out there on the range when you might have said there's a real environmental problem here. We're going to overgraze the range if we keep bringing cattle to Montana in the numbers that are in the background there. And the question was, well, how might this problem get resolved? And so a colleague and I wrote a book called The Not So Wild, Wild West, in which we looked at how the cattlemen dealt with this issue of overgrazing. So you can imagine you're out there grazing your cows, and you're getting cows fat, and you're taking them to market, and you're making a profit, and somebody else shows up with a herd of cows, and you say, you know, we're going to have a conflict here. It's just like that Alaska fishery picture I showed you. How would you resolve that? And when I ask this of students, they often say, well, you'd get the government in there and regulate it. I said, yeah, but there was no government out there at that time. We didn't even have a state of Montana yet, let alone a territory of Montana. How would you resolve that? Well, these nice folks got together and said, we're going to form cattlemen's associations, and our cattlemen's associations are going to carve up the range, and we're going to define the rights, and we're going to enforce the rights. And they created customary grazing territories. And they defined them by saying, you know, your territory goes along this ridge line down to the big rock along by the stream down there, back down the stream to the big tree, and up to the ridge again. And that's your territory. And there was a market in these, and if you looked at that market, it would have been very much like the lease to sales price of fisheries. This market was active. People were conserving the grass. They were worried about how they grazed it. Now, sure, there was a problem. When somebody showed up and said, well, what gave you guys the right to form this Cattlemen's Association and keep us out. And these nice fellows here reached down to their hip and said, well, we were here first, and we have the rights because we've claimed them, we've defined them, and they're ours. You're welcome to go over to Wyoming or someplace else, but you're not going to graze here in Montana. The net result was we ended up with a property rights system, if you will, an environmental market. Now, nobody was thinking about whether there was sage grouse habitat or the kinds of things that those of us who are wealthy enough today to worry about. We weren't thinking about those, but we were stewarding that resource because this organization, the Cattlemen's Association, made it a valuable asset. So where does all this take it? How do we create this? Well, I think the bottom line from the research I've done, and especially the research on fisheries, but in general, what I think we've learned is that if we can focus environmental policy on how to create some clear and stable rules about who owns this asset. So Hank Fisher can go out and buy grazing rights and retire them and move the cattle. If we can create that, then we can create assets that make the environment something that people will steward rather than shun. But it really doesn't work if we throw all this up in the air and say, let's just let it fall where it may. And so if we erode the property rights, if we make them up for grabs, and that's what has happened in many cases with grazing in the United States, where we've said, well, you know, you guys can lobby for more rights to grazing and you people can lobby for less rights to grazing, fight over this in the political process, and guess what? We end up without environmental assets and we don't take good care of that resource. So why think about markets now? And I think the answer is quite simple. First off, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. In the United States, the classic example is the Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1971. When we passed that act, we said, well, we've got a river in Cleveland, Ohio that's burning. And it was the cover of National Geographic, and people said, oh my goodness, how can we have that? Well, nobody sat back and said, you know, what are the marginal benefits and marginal costs of cleaning up a river? They said, if it's burning, fix it. Tell those people who are dumping stuff that burns into this water to stop dumping. And we passed the Clean Water Act and said, stop. It was easy to do. Nobody was questioning it. Today, we argue over little itsy-bitsy amounts of emissions into water, and we can't measure them. We don't even really know the effect. I can't ever get to this part of a lecture like this without thinking about, in Montana, we have the Madison River, a premier trout stream. I'm talking to you people, that's, you know, we're kind of a tier or two below New Zealand trout streams, but we're pretty good. And this river is out of compliance with EPA standards on arsenic. And so when I heard this, I was on a government commission and I asked, well, how bad is it? And the person said, well, you know, the arsenic levels in the Madison are so bad that they're increasing cancer rates. And I said, oh, you know, that's that's like a burning river. How bad is it? And they said, well, if you drink 1 liter of untreated water every day of your life for 70 years, and you eat I've forgotten the unit, I think it was a 1/4 pound of fish from the river every day of your life for 70 years, it increases the incidence of cancer by 1 in 10,000. I said, people in Montana drink beer, not water. What's not a problem? Anyway, no, I'm not quite that callous. But the point here is, you know, we are not talking about picking low-hanging fruit. This cost communities along that river millions of dollars to improve their treatment plants for a problem that was somewhat questionable. It wasn't like an Agatha Christie novel where, you know, somebody swigs down a glass of wine and dies. It wasn't that kind of arsenic level. So we picked a low-hanging regulatory fruit. And then secondly, I think the reason we need to think more about markets now is quite simply markets work. Fred Krupp is the president of the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the 900-pound environmental gorillas in the United States, a good friend of mine. Fred is a lawyer, and he says, when I went to work for Environmental Defense Fund, our unwritten model was sue the bastards. And they made it quite clear. You know, we're going to take you to that regulatory court, and we're going to hold you accountable to make you stop your pollution. Now the written motto of the Environmental Defense Fund is finding ways that work. And Fred back to fisheries, is just an ardent supporter of ITQs as a way to solve the fisheries problem. He works hard at convincing people this is a good way to do it. He has supported the SO2 trading market in the U.S. and opposed the erosion of that market. This is an environmentalist who has said these are the ways that work, and I think Fred and people like Hank Fisher are the next generation of environmentalists who are really what I call enviropreneurs, environmental entrepreneurs, who are finding ways to get rid of the zero sum, it's mine or it's yours, and finding cooperative ways to move the agenda forward, not just for using our resources better, not just for improving the human welfare we get from the use of those resources, but making sure we protect our environment at the same time. If we can make this happen more and more, then we're going to have our cake and eat it too. Well, I will take some questions, but at this stage I always remember that a teacher of mine in high school was teaching speech, told me to remember this when I was speaking, and he said, make sure when you're speaking, stand up to be seen. He said, make sure when you're speaking, speak up to be heard. Then he said, most importantly, sit down to be appreciated. Thank you very much. That said, I'm not going to sit down. But
thank you very much, Terry, for both and highly entertaining, but also extremely provocative and thoughtful and informed presentation. I'm sure there are.
I'll take questions from anywhere except the front row here.
There are two just there.
You mentioned Hank raised $100,000, some of it coming from those pictures. How else did he raise all that money? That's a great effort. Just trying to figure out how he did
Yeah. Well, this is a classic problem for economists. We worry about what we call the free rider problem. When I'm doing this in a U.S. audience, I like to say, how many of you bought a poster? And I raise my hand and I say, you scumbags out there, you're free riding on me. And Hank has tried to take advantage of that. He's tried through his former organization, Defenders of Wildlife, to convince people, hey, this is our responsibility. We want wolves, let's get them there faster. So it's a hard sell. He now works for the National Wildlife Federation, and they haven't done poster campaigns. They've done much more of, we want to move cattle out of the harm's way of the buffalo and the grizzly bears and the wolves. Help us do that. Help us do it in a cooperative kind of way. So it's a matter of being entrepreneurial, thinking how you can convince me to buy your poster, how I can convince you to give money to a fund that will help move the the cattle out of buffalo's way. And one way Hank is doing this much more effectively is he can point, yeah, I solved the wolf problem in a way. Now, it isn't to say that every rancher wasn't still thinking about ain't nobody killed you yet, but he just disarmed that whole debate so nicely, and he can point to that as, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. I've found new ways to make this happen, and I think that's I lecture to lots of students, and I always say, that's your job. Go out and be an entrepreneur. Think entrepreneurially, and it takes that. Follow up?
Sorry, just to clarify.
I'm just putting Roger off.
All of that $100,000 came from the posters.
Yeah, well, I shouldn't say all of it. I think he had some donors who kicked in some money that would probably more than, they didn't buy $35 worth. So there are, at least in the United States, a lot of wealthy people willing to invest in the environment, and they give to Hank because they know he's going to make it happen quickly, effectively, finding ways that work. Okay, Roger.
Terry, New Zealand has the worst record in the world for bird extinctions. New Zealand used to be known as birdland when the Europeans arrived. Would you advocate property rights to our native birds in order to save them?
Absolutely, I would. I look over here to my good friend Tamari. Let me put it in the first. Pardon? Whoops. I missed your comment. Pigeons. Let me take an example that I'm a lot more familiar with. One that is like the wolf example, just created this huge controversy in the United States. the spotted owl. The spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest was this little tiny owl that people said is endangered. And we've got to stop logging. Well, you know, go back to good wolf is a dead wolf. Most people were saying the same about spotted owls. The sooner they're gone, then we won't have to worry about them because they will be extinct, and it would be better if they were. And so we had this huge battle over the spotted owl. Eventually, the Clinton administration shut down logging on federal lands in the United States, or sorry, in the Pacific Northwest where the spotted owl existed. And the private landowners, mind you, said, oh, this is a great deal because now our timber's worth more, but that's another side story to this whole debate. The question was, what might we have done? And the answer is, suppose we had made spotted owls an asset. I have seen videos of Simpson Timber building spotted owl boxes. This was before the rulings came down, building spotted owl boxes, putting them in their trees, and seeing these spotted owls foraging in their forests. And they were proving they could raise spotted owls. But as soon as we said, if you have spotted owls, we're shutting down your timber cutting, guess what happened to the number of spotted owls around there? They went like this. They said, look, if we wanted to save the spotted owl, we could have just paid Simpson Timber and Weyerhaeuser and the other big timber companies to provide spotted owl habitat. And had we done it, we would have a huge market in spotted owl manure. Okay, what does that tell us then about how you prevent extinctions? We are fighting over the sage grouse, a fairly large bird in the prairies of the west in the United States, lives in sagebrush. And it is hugely controversial. And many ranchers are back to the wolf example. They don't want sage grouse around. Groups like the Environmental Defense Fund are saying, let's go out and lease lease sage grouse habitat. If we pay people to have habitat, I bet we'll get more. And Martha, my wife, and I know a rancher in Montana who said, you just tell me what species you want, and I will provide you habitat for it. I can do it and make money at farming and ranching. So suppose we could make it such that people owned the birds of New Zealand. There's John. John Reed has done a paper for a book I'm doing on unlocking the wealth of Indian nations. And in his paper and others about other indigenous property rights, what we find is, you know, indigenous people understood property rights too. And if we could find ways to go back to some of the property rights regime that existed for some of these species, we probably could move the ball forward very quickly.
I just have a question. You've been trying to make a case for how market incentives can solve a lot of environmental problems. And I just wanted to sort of push this towards the boundary or the frontier.
Okay, another question.
I was just wondering, do you think there are cases of, I'm thinking of examples of non-point source pollution, like, you know, polluting groundwater because of cattle, where it's very hard for regulators or for anybody else to know exactly where the pollution is coming from, because it can be coming from thousands of places. Do you think that in difficult cases like that, are there market solutions?
Yeah. I thought you were going to ask a hard question. I was waiting for the, if you're so smart, what about carbon? But yeah, that's next. Okay. So whenever I think of this, I'm reminded of serving on a PhD dissertation at Stanford, and, you know, arguably some decent students at Stanford. This was a dissertation in engineering. And the young woman who wrote this dissertation did a Bayesian analysis of groundwater pollution. I didn't have a clue what this thesis was about, actually, but I went to her defense, and she was brilliant at just teaching. And she held up a glass like this. It had coffee in it, and she said, "Suppose that I dump a little cream into this coffee. Could we tell where the cream came from?" She said, "Suppose we could stop it right when it hit the top of the coffee." I said, "Well, obviously we could. We'd know it was right there." And then she said, "Well, what if we just waited a couple of seconds and it went down into the cup a little farther, and now it's not quite black, but it's starting to get a little cream color to it. And what if we," and then she swirled it around so it was all mixed up. She said, "Look, it's not easy." But then she did some analyses of how could you infer backwards where this stuff came from if you knew what the medium was, where this stuff was being dumped, if you knew exactly what the stuff was and how it was permeating itself through the coffee, if you knew all that, you could infer backwards, and then, she said, and then you can have a property rights solution. So, those are some big ifs, to be sure. So they're not simple. It's not simple to define the rights and enforce the rights. But if we start thinking in terms of this is a rights problem, and this is what she was working on, she was trying to think of how can we better the science, what universities are really about, so that we better understand the relationship between where the stuff hits the top of the coffee and swirls around in it. I'm not here to say that establishing an environmental market is zero cost. We economists are fascinated with and write tomes about transaction costs, the costs of coming up with these property rights systems. And usually when I get to the last question and they say, well, what about the carbon issue? I say, look, if I were that smart, I wouldn't be here. The carbon issue is one, I don't have a solution that says, oh yeah, here's the way to think of the coffee cup for carbon. It's not simple. But there are so many simple ones out there, and again, hats off to New Zealand with the ITQ system. That one was a pretty simple one in a way. All that we can hope is that we keep it simple and don't screw it up. Do I have to take Tamari? Oh, shoot. I'll let you.
I got two questions. You can answer one or the other or none. The first question is the SO2 example is really interesting. That the government can come in and basically degrade property rights and the market just collapses. Are there ways that government can credibly commit to not do that? That's my first question. And the second question has to do with the issue about free riding on making contributions towards environmental causes. How would you feel about, rather than funding some of the government environmental agencies, using some of that budget to basically have matching grants to environmental organizations?
I'll take C. No. Well, how do you credibly commit? Well, you don't credibly commit by creating ITQs, by writing into the laws. We did the act in the United States. It says, these are not property rights. I mean, you do that, it'd be like saying, it's your house, but it's not really yours, and if we want to take it tomorrow, we're going to take it, and you're going to be out in the cold. That's not a way to credibly commit. The way you credibly commit is do what New Zealand did with ITQs. You say they're property rights, and then when you want to deal with the property rights I don't know whether it's fair to say forgot to include, and I would guess it's not just a matter of forgetting, but once you find out there are some inequities in this property rights system you create, you fix it by buying back the property rights you gave out in the first place. That's a credible commitment. It's why, if you look at those New Zealand lease to sale prices, they were starting to go the other direction when there was the question of how the Maori claims were going to be dealt with. And once they were dealt with the way they were, then the sales price rose relative to the lease price. That's the way to make a commitment. If you want to make a commitment to saving endangered species, you go out and you say, we'll buy some habitat. And all of a sudden, you've made that kind of commitment. To the second part of the question of, well, what about, since there is this free rider, public goods kind of aspect, what about using the auspices of government, which is in one sense created to overcome the free rider problem, right? Come April 15th, I don't get a letter from the IRS saying, would you like to make a contribution? Would you like to buy a poster? No, I get a letter saying, pay us your money. That overcomes the free rider problem. So how might you use that? Well, let me, before turning to should you fund environmental groups, we have a part of our agricultural policy called the Conservation Reserve Program. We pay farmers not to produce stuff. And I've advocated for a long time, let's pay them to produce stuff. Not wheat, not corn, but let's pay them to produce bird habitat if that's what we want. And again, back to this friend, you start paying him to produce habitat, and we're going to have lots of it. So I don't object to that being an important role for government to overcome this free rider problem. Well, what about making grants available? If we said to the environmental community in New Zealand or the United States, look, here's $100 million. We're going to have an organization, and there's always lobbying involved, but we're going to have an organization that's going to allocate this on the basis of credible proposals for resolving these problems, saving birds. There is no question in my mind that pretty quickly, I mean, we've got groups like the Nature Conservancy. I'll come back to them if I can just quickly. But we could really get a long way. So I can't resist for the Nature Conservancy related to this quota issue. The Nature Conservancy went into a place called Morro Bay on the west coast, about halfway down the California coast. And they decided the way to overcome the problem with trawlers that were scraping up the sea bottom and really ruining kelp beds, ruining abalone beds, depleting the fishery there. They said, here's the way to problem. They did a Hank Fisher kind of approach. They went in and bought the permits from the people who had the fishing permits. And, you know, that was a willing buyer, willing seller transaction. You might think, well, that's really a nice market solution. But a lot of people in the community said, hey, wait a minute. You know, those fishermen who were out there every day were friends of mine, and now they're out of business. And they used to come into my cafe and have a cup of coffee every day, and they're not doing that anymore. And the Nature Conservancy said, you know, plus, we're finding that, you know, there wasn't a real problem with fishing if you did it in the right way. And so they took the permits that they bought and they started leasing them back to the fishermen with constraints. It's okay to fish, you just can't fish at this part of the season. It's okay to fish, but you can't use that technique. The Nature Conservancy has taken the permits they purchased and are now making more money than they spent on them. And in the process, they're not destroying all the kelp beds and the abalone fishery, and the list goes on. They're making money. The fishermen are back in business. They're doing it more efficiently. They're doing it with different equipment, but they're solving the problem. That could well have been a proposal to this $100 million grant that I was suggesting. And I think, you know, that's a role for government to play to encourage that kind of thing. So that's, you now wish I'd taken C, don't you?
Question of you talked about creating and enforcing property rights within a well-defined legal space. What about outside territorial waters? I mean, who owns the high seas?
Yeah. Well, the question, if you didn't hear it, was, you know, okay, this all might sound nice in a country with where you've got a 200-mile limit and you've got a court system and you've got a government that's not that corrupt anyway. I can speak to mine anyway. I would emphasize that corrupt. So how do you, okay, makes sense there. But what about when you don't have that? And before I turn to the high seas, just take the developing world. Setting up the campfire program in African countries is not exactly an easy thing to do, because you don't have the government there to do what I argue is the first role of government: help define and enforce property rights, create a stable rule of law. So you don't have that in a lot of the developing world. And so groups like Campfire just say, they're kind of like the cowboys in my picture. They go in and say, well, let's forget about government. Let's figure out a way to empower the community to do this. So that's part of the issue of a legal system. But now let's go to the high seas. The high seas are much like the carbon problem. I mean, it's much more difficult in the property, the environmental markets. But Gary and I talked some about solutions on the high seas, and there are lots of efforts to create cooperatives amongst nations to resolve this issue. I think that's the role, if I can go beyond just a country's government, that's a role that the United Nations can get involved in and do. But thinking from a property rights perspective, how do we get the countries that are involved to agree to a quota for that area? How do we divvy it up? And this back to the carbon question you didn't answer or ask. The same problem exists. If we're going to create a carbon market and use an SO2 trading kind of approach with carbon credits, how do we decide who gets them? And then, so we say, all right, China, you get this many credits, and China says, well, I think we'll just emit a little more carbon. And what do we hesitate to think what the answer might be to how we resolve that problem, especially coming from the United States, where we think we can fix your problems anywhere in the world. But it's clearly a much more intractable problem. But I think it's one where, thought of in this property rights sphere, begins to have, I think we can illuminate the problem better and start thinking about how we create a boundary around it, a grazing territory, and then allocate within it. But again, I don't. There's no simple solution to those kind of open ocean fishery issues.
Any last question?
I knew I could beat you down. Oh, wait a minute! I said none from the front row.
I hesitate to delay the prospect of socialising, but my great challenge is to the south of where we are now, on the coast south of Dunedin. There's a large area of kelp beds in the inshore fishery, and they've been destroyed, and the fishery with it. Not as a consequence of overfishing, not as a consequence of the ITQ structure, but as a consequence of the both urban and agricultural intensification on the adjoining coast. And the ordinary rainwater washing off zinc-plated corrugated iron roofs into storage systems and going out onto the coast is destroying that kelp, as well as intensive agricultural production and fertilizer runoff and so on. And we go a bit further south, we've got where our own Ngāi people are interested in the kelp as a mahinga kai resource for making storage kits. The kelp is in poor health, and you can't manufacture poha with it. Again, because of farm and residential runoff. And it's extraordinarily difficult to construct a model which is you get an end result in a property in fish off the coast or in a right of access to fish. Yet you've got the city, people don't recognise what ordinary stormwater does without farming intensification. I'm not talking of sewerage. I'm talking of just the ordinary business of a whole lot of urban people and water running off roads, knocking out habitat. And I don't think we've got a very easy way of pinpointing the source so we can actually, your PhD student with her coffee analogy, I think, would end up with a kaleidoscope soup if she was trying to do that with the kind of situation I described. So even though I'm a proponent of the base thesis, I don't think it is necessarily a panacea for the kind of problem I've just described.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'm not here to pretend that there are market solutions to every one of these problems where, to start with, you have to be able to define the rights and enforce the rights. And these are cases where with the technology and the science we have today, we can't easily do that. And when that's the case, we have to think about regulatory solutions. So I don't deny the role for regulatory solutions in solving some of these problems. But I come back to the question of the open ocean fisheries. If we start, if I could back up quickly in my slides, which I won't do, and just if I can leave you with nothing else, all environmental problems are property rights problems. The problem is the people who are fishing the paua and are now or harvesting the kelp are being harmed by these. The problem is we can't say who these are. We can't identify easily individuals. If we think of it as a property rights problem and begin to ask, is there a way to make the people who are doing this liable for the problem that's caused? Is there a way for the people who want to harvest kelp to somehow pay the people upstream to stop doing that, move the cattle out of the way of the bison and the grizzly bears? If we think of it through that lens, I think we open the door for environmental entrepreneurs. And I don't make the case that being an environmental entrepreneur is an easy thing to do. I only make the case that if you think of it this way, you start to uncover solutions you would have never thought of. And I think that's the key to creating a future generation of environmentalists that'll be even more effective than those of us who are not smart enough to answer the kind of tough questions that I can't answer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, Terry, I do think you have now earned that glass of white wine. It's definitely your property.
But I'm going to be the last one out there.
There's one for you. And that's an extremely, I think, inspirational note to end on.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I will return in less than 30 years, I promise. Or threaten.